Let me thank Saskia for that very gracious introduction, which is a bit intimidating. And I also want to thank Elisa for bringing us here. I was going to say how much I regretted missing the first day, but the second day has been so overwhelming in its content and presentation that I'm almost grateful. I'm not sure it would have been a kind of medically treatable information overload otherwise, or conceptual overload. Fortunately, in the program, I'm supposed to make remarks, which I think is an invitation to be impressionistic and non-systematic, in contrast to some of these very extraordinarily challenging and fascinating presentations that we've just heard. Listening to what was said, especially during the day, I come away with this sense that there are two charismatic words that dominate our reflections: complexity and urgency. And I think maybe the real challenge is to, in a non-simplistic way, to imagine a dialectic between those two ideas. Can we cope? How do we cope with complexity in this new digital age where I think knowledge has become so sophisticated in its extent and depth that it does, I think, often paralyze the ethical sensibility. So what I think, and maybe this is a overly provocative way of putting it, I think one of the urgencies of our time is to imagine or develop a moral epistemology. In other words, recognizing that we need to solve some urgent problems, and so therefore we shouldn't exclude the normative from the domain of knowledge. And in that sense, we shouldn't altogether succumb to the Enlightenment principles of trusting instrumental rationality as the way of coping with the challenges confronting humanity. And what I think is unique, or the originality of this historical moment we're living in, is that for the first time, these challenges of global scope really affect the survival of the species. There've always been urgencies at the level of civilization, of society, of community. But now we have challenges at the level of the species, and we don't have the mechanisms to address them. See, at these other levels, we have the governance structures, and you can conceive of the United Nations as a impulse in the direction of creating the capabilities needed for addressing challenges of global scope and that involve threats to the destiny of the species. But it's obviously not, the United Nations is very important for many reasons, But what it can't do, and what is needed to be done, is it can't protect the human interest or the global interest. What it can do, and the Paris Agreement on the climate change is the maybe most remarkable recent example, is it can maximize it can maximize the aggregation of national interests. And what the world depended upon, especially with the advent of nuclear weapons, was it depended upon this kind of aggregation of national interest plus benevolent global leadership, which was, in the period after World War II, provided by the United States to a large degree. But we're now in a period, ironically, where the severity of the global challenges is coupled with what one might even call the malevolence of U.S. global leadership. And therefore, there's you have neither the governance mechanisms within the UN, which is too weak to address, to protect the human interest or promote the global interest. You also don't have the complement of benevolent global leadership, which, in my view, the state system always depended upon. It was never just a state-centric system. It depended upon the relative benevolence, or at least the sensible role being played by the dominant state actors in the system. There is, it seems to me, also, listening to our discussions and the interplay of global law and global justice in particular, a sense that unless you also look rigorously at the relationship between global law and global power, you're missing an important part of the relevant reality. And the shaping of law has been predominantly an instrument used by the powerful to protect and promote their interests. I mean, the most, I suppose, crude example of this is in relation to the protection of investments and in the whole international economic area. Law was used as a legitimation of the exploitation of weaker non-Western countries, essentially, and the entrenching of legal interests at the expense of these subjugated foreign societies. My own experience with global law has been very problem-driven rather than framed abstractly. And I became interested, actually, in environmental law as a reaction to some of the operational practices of the United States in the Vietnam War, and particularly the use of Agent Orange and other chemicals to destroy large parts of the agricultural capabilities of an underdeveloped Vietnam. And it led me to the idea that it was very important to develop ecocide as a complement to genocide if we really were to take seriously the relationship of humans to nature in a collaborative and sustainable way. I mention this only as a way of saying that, and it probably does reflect the American, my own American legal pedagogy, which is very much premised on problem solving and looking at cases and problems as the guide to conceptualizing more generally. And in that spirit, I'm sorry that Neil Walker isn't here, because I have a kind of strong disagreement, a respectful disagreement with his way of shaping useful knowledge in the global law field. Because as I understood from what I was able to read, he is telling us that two things we should avoid, which are the two things I think we should embrace. And the two things he tells us to avoid are legal idealism, which he feels degenerates into utopianism, and radical critique, which he argues leads to structural fatalism. And in that sense, the utopian idea is essentially saying that's useless, it's not going to happen, it's kind of off the chart of realism. And the structural fatalism idea, the radical critique idea, is also not a realistic way. You have to work within the system in order to get anything useful done. That's my, I hope, and please correct me if I'm wrong about that, but my sense is he wants to address the global law agenda from the perspective of what I would call the domain of feasibility. And what's wrong with that, from my point of view, is that what is feasible is not congruent with what is necessary or with what is desirable, and that we need the utopian thinking for the desirable and to some extent for the necessary. In other words, what I would try to argue is we're in a global situation where we depend upon a necessary utopianism if we are to have a sustainable future. And that leads me to say that if you allow this gap between what is feasible and what is necessary to persist, what happens, and is happening in my view, is that you generate extremisms. You generate the kind of extremisms that we see emerging in different parts of the world politically. Terrorism at one form of it, and autocracy is another form. And in addition to extremisms, you have denialism. That is, climate skeptics is the most obvious case, but it's also true if you look at the way nuclear weapons have been addressed over the past half century. In both cases, the threat and the risk is suppressed because there's no way that it can be addressed feasibly within this domain of liberal incrementalism. See, and it's The domain of feasibility is really a non-philosophical expression of liberal incrementalism, which is the dominant sort of policy-making ideology of most governing elites in the world. So if you have extremism and denialism as the response to this gap between necessity and feasibility, then the only thing that's left to close that gap without being destructive is this, what I call a horizon of desire. In other words, what is desirable is also a motivating and generating force that is constructively in touch with the scale of the challenges. See, and what I'm trying to articulate in this impressionistic way is that feasibility doesn't connect with the scale and depth of the challenges. And as long as we have as our policy-forming global law-making orientation the idea of incrementalism, we will succumb to what I call the Nero syndrome, namely fiddling while Rome is burning. See, and that thinking we're doing something, but really not addressing these fundamental challenges. Maybe this overstates the urgency side of the dialectic between complexity and urgency, and it doesn't mean to depreciate the work of those that are trying to make things better within the domain of feasibility. So I'm not, what I would argue is that we need to work incrementally, but we shouldn't, in that process, and that's where I disagree with Neil Walker, we shouldn't delegitimize either utopian thinking or what I call necessary utopian adaptation or radical critique. We need to ask the question, can a capitalist, neo-capitalist form of globalization address the global challenges confronting humanity? We need to ask that question. And if you do, and you can only ask that question in the spirit of radical critique. You can't confront, and most economists avoid that question because the ideology of feasibility or of incremental liberalism is dominant within the academy as well as within political and economic elites. And so my plea for a moral epistemology is one that incorporates radical critique and utopian thinking with that as essential complements to this prevailing understanding of liberal internationalism. My own way of thinking about that has been to think about to put this idea of feasibility, necessity, and desire in the form of horizons. What are the horizons of feasibility that now are being addressed by policymakers and academicians and others, and then how can we best diagnose the necessities that are associated with this situation that we face, in other words, horizons of necessity, and trying to identify the gaps between feasibility and necessity, and then to project horizons of desire as a intellectually and politically potential way of closing the gap, and putting these two other avenues of response, denialism and extremism, as failing to address the gap. The gap won't disappear, in my view. So let me, I don't know how much time we have, but let me stop these impressionistic remarks. And I know that it's been a long day, and you've been very attentive at the end of this long day. So let me stop here, and if we have time for discussion, I welcome questions, as long as they're not too difficult.